After 10 years of war, the latest appeals for financial help for Syria's suffering people. The European Union is sponsoring a new international fundraising effort and says it won't look the other way when it comes to the Syrian crisis. But what influence can the EU really have in Syria? This is Roundtable. Hello, I'm Robin Dwyer. The European Union says it wants to see a political solution to Syria's decade-long war. The arrival of more than 1 million refugees means it's still a European problem, but can the EU be part of the answer? This month marked the 10th anniversary of the Syrian uprising, the start of a decade of war. Hundreds of thousands of people have been killed. Millions have been forced to flee their homes, many of them seeking refuge in Europe. With little prospect of an end to the fighting, the violence is now concentrated in the part of northwestern Syria not controlled by President Assad. The latest international effort to raise funds for relief efforts has been taking place in Brussels this week, sponsored by the UN and the European Union. The EU says it wants to encourage dialogue between all parties with a role and a stake in the Syrian conflict. So, can the EU be part of a solution by shaping developments in any meaningful way? Joining us on Roundtable today in Amman, Jordan, we have Samah Hadid. She is the head of Middle East Advocacy at the Norwegian Refugee Council. In London, we have both James Watt, a former British diplomat who was ambassador to Lebanon, Jordan and Egypt, and Dr. Reem Turkmani, director of the Syria Research Programme at the London School of Economics. Thanks very much indeed, all of you, for being with us on the programme today. So I wonder if, first of all, we can set out the European Union's role in Syria. And James, as the storm clouds began to gather, what was in the thoughts and minds of EU countries as they sought to position themselves?
Well, there was a humanitarian imperative. What had led the European Union to intervene with NATO, of course, in Libya was to safeguard the lives of civilians who were being threatened quite seriously by an oppressive regime. And so the same thing was happening in Syria. And I think the Europeans just acted like that. They didn't actually have the means, as they soon discovered. They didn't have the means to change anything on the ground, apart from providing some moral support and some humanitarian assistance.
And Dr. Reem Turkmani, I wonder how much of what was in the European Union's minds was concentrating on what was right for them, rather than necessarily what was right for Syria at that time.
I think initially they thought about what is right for them and for Syria, but there's certainly something they've got wrong back then. I think the important question now is, what was the EU perspective and policy objective on this issue on Syria 10 years ago? And did they forecast the political scenario that we see today? Did it realize the policy objectives of the EU? I would say no. I think 10 years ago, the emphasis was more on regime change. And the idea was that Assad would step down if he's asked to do so by Europeans, Americans, and some regional powers. 10 years on, we see this is not the case. The country is in ruins, thanks mainly to the regime. So I think the EU got the timeline wrong and not the objectives. So they thought the change is going to happen overnight. Obviously, it's not. It's going to be more incremental, slow-based. So I think it's important to revisit that to correct the EU track on Syria.
And Samah Hadid, what do you think? Do you think the current situation was foreseeable 10 years ago?
I think the situation now has worsened. 10 years since the start of the crisis in Syria, we're seeing the country facing economic collapse. Humanitarian needs are skyrocketing, and it's only getting worse for many, many families across the country. My organization, the Norwegian Refugee Council, has been assisting Syrian families for many, many years now across the entire country. But the reports that we're getting from the ground are incredibly alarming. Now millions of Syrians are going hungry. Child labor is on the rise. We're seeing children who, instead of being in school, are now queuing for hours in front of bakeries and markets to support their families. Children who are now seeking to work before going to school to support their families financially to cope with the economic collapse hitting the country. We also have analysis that shows that families are going back to displacement camps inside Syria. This is all happening 10 years since the start of the crisis. So I think now the crucial question is, what will donors in the EU and elsewhere do to avert a catastrophe on the horizon for millions of Syrians?
So before we look to now, I want to go back again to 10 years ago. Where, James, do you think that the international community did go wrong when it comes to Syria?
Well, I agree with Dr. Turkmani that they completely misunderstood how it might be possible for the regime to collapse, how everybody wanted the regime to collapse and give way to something which responded much better to the needs and expectations of the citizens, but it simply didn't. And that miscalculation was shared in the United States, in Washington. And of course, to a large degree, the Europeans were taking their lead from the Americans. It was obviously pooling assessments, pooling understanding and so on, but everybody got it wrong. And in fact, what then happened was the rise of the Islamists raised the stakes for Russia, which, as you know, later on intervened in order to preserve the regime largely against the Islamist threat, Russian policy being based mostly on trying to suppress the sources of Islamist terrorism in the region which threatened Russia.
So, Dr. Reem Turkmani, do you think that this was foreseeable at that time?
Look, no one saw exactly where we're going to be today, but I think, as I said 10 years ago, some assumptions that were made were simply wrong. And the problem is that we still live with the consequences. Although the EU kind of changed its position, so now it doesn't talk about the regime change anymore. It talks about political solution, 2254, election, changing the constitution. So it has incremental change in mind, and I think that is a step in the right direction. But we still live the consequences, because very early on in the conflict, when they thought this is going to be a very quick change, like in Egypt, like in Tunisia, they cut all ties. They closed all embassies. They withdrew from Syria. So they lost presence. They lost leverage. And the only leverage they had after that is the fact that they foot the humanitarian bill. And that's not enough, right? So to be influential, you have to have relation. You have to have ties. You have to have, like, for example, most of the external trade before the conflict for Syria was with the EU, with the European countries. And now it's mainly with Russia and with Iran. Yeah. So that's how this repositioning affected the leverage. So something needs to be reversed there, but it's so difficult, especially that very heavy set of sanctions were imposed very early on as well, that also paralyzed the economy in the country and pushed it more towards the shadow, benefited Russia and Iran because now they got stronger stronghold of the Syrian regime because it's tied to them more than before. Almost on everything. So anything that the EU, that Syria cannot source now anymore from the EU, they go and get it either from Iran or Russia or China. So it's really difficult to shift it, but still the EU can now do something to make a difference beyond the funding of the humanitarian operations and all the governance and stabilization programs that they do support.
I want to look at some numbers now of the impact of all this on the Syrian people. And according to UN estimates, roughly 5.6 million people have fled Syria, a third of whom are under 11 years old. An additional 6.7 million are internally displaced. Roughly 12.4 million people do not have adequate food or heating, and 60% of children in Syria are in urgent need of education, food, and heating. And Samah, you have first-hand experience of the situation in Syria. What is it like? Just how bad is it?
Well, the situation in Syria is hitting crisis point, where Syrians are struggling really to survive. Families are struggling to cope with not only the humanitarian crisis, but now the economic crisis hitting the country that is only going to get worse. we've seen firsthand the devastating consequences of the war, of the collapse of the economy, and the lack of assistance to Syrians. And so I think ahead of this week's donor conference that the EU is co-hosting with the UN, it's absolutely crucial that donors don't abandon Syrians in need, don't turn away from Syrians 10 years on since the start of the crisis. We need more humanitarian assistance, but also longer term support to help Syrians rebuild their lives, to help basic services be restored, to support schools being rebuilt and hospitals, and to support Syrians to recover from this economic collapse taking place inside the country. But the situation has also been really dire for Syrian refugees in neighboring countries as well, where the majority of refugees reside. They languish in limbo because they can't return back to Syria. They're not given opportunities to fully integrate into neighboring countries. And so they're stuck facing dire living conditions. And I think it's really important that the EU, of course, continues its assistance to neighboring countries, but also pushes for neighboring countries to enact reforms and remove legal barriers that prevent Syrian refugees from working, that prevent them from accessing basic rights. So these sort of policy and legal reforms are very much needed now. But the other worrying issue, of course, is that the resettlement of Syrian refugees has been shamefully low. And the EU, as well as other governments elsewhere, have failed to do their fair share to resettle refugees and support finding a solution to the refugee crisis. So we definitely call on governments in the EU and elsewhere to lift their resettlement rates of Syrian refugees who desperately need safe haven.
Well, let's talk about this conference that Samah mentioned there. And this is the 5th such conference. It's focusing on fundraising for relief. And Reem, do you think this could make a difference?
Yeah, I think, yes, it can make a difference. And fundraising for relief is always needed. I was very well put by Samah. But I think the most important contribution the EU can make to end this unbearable humanitarian suffering in Syria is not the funding it provides. It's putting all its political capital behind the political solution. This is what is going to end the suffering. And not just continuing to treat Syria as if it's an earthquake. It's not, right? I mean, it's originally a political conflict. And sadly, the geopolitical dynamic, the American-Russian intervention, all of this are making things much, much worse. And they're making things dragging for longer and longer. The EU presence would offset this external intervention and would hopefully give the political solution much needed momentum. So we needed to be very present there and not just say we support the UN. No, they have to be really active. They are the ones who are concerned more than anyone else actually with this conflict. They are closer to Syria than Russia and the US, whose contribution, sadly, until now, is only prolonging the conflict. Now, that is not to undermine or underestimate the contributions they make in the Brussels conference. Absolutely not. It's fundamental. The EU remains the biggest contributor to funding in Syria. But I think because of the economic situation, the economic collapse, the situation in Lebanon, because the funds are drying out. I mean, we saw the UK now cut down its funding to Syria by 2/3 because of the COVID crisis. So we're expecting less and less pledges because of all of that. There's a need to rethink the modes of funding and what do you fund and how. How can you make it more sustainable? Support early recovery, build resilience, help people rebuild their lives rather than continue to give them food parcels.
Well, I just want to pick up on your point there, Reem, about the UK cutting its aid budget, because obviously these are difficult times at the moment, people focusing their strategies on tackling the COVID-19 pandemic. And James, do you think that countries have got enough money to give to this conflict? It's estimated that over $10 billion is needed in aid this year alone.
Well, there's certainly growing donor fatigue, both in this case and in Yemen and so many other cases. There's no doubt that there's less willingness on the part of the donor countries to give money, which is a great shame, but it's a political reality in some respects. The needs, meanwhile, are growing. So I think it would take a dose of political optimism to actually say, okay, we're going to put more money into this. And I agree strongly with what both Samah and Reem have said, both about the need to provide all the humanitarian aid they can, but also Europe needs to take part actively and creatively in creating a diplomatic solution, which is not at all easy. As you well know, the lines are very firmly drawn. The regime is simply not responding to anything diplomatic. Iran has got all its priorities elsewhere. They're not going to make concessions on Syria. The Russians would like to see political progress in a solution in Syria, but one which keeps the regime in place. And that is politically extremely difficult for the West to accept because of the huge list of war crimes that the regime has committed.
I want to explore the idea of a solution, a diplomatic solution, in a minute. But before we leave behind the people of Syria, Samah, what practically would be the most important thing that could be done on the ground right now?
Well, it's essential that donors just continue to fund humanitarian assistance because humanitarian needs are skyrocketing and they're only growing. They're not decreasing. But what's also important is supporting longer-term needs such as rebuilding resilience, early recovery, creating jobs, and helping Syrians to invest in rebuilding their communities that will benefit them now, but also in the future. I think also what's needed to pick up on what the other guests have mentioned is, of course, finding a political solution to this crisis. Syria desperately needs a political settlement. Governments who have influence over warring parties need to push for a long-lasting ceasefire so that Syrians can rebuild their lives and we can see an end to the violence and displacement.
Well, I want to just fill you in on the point of view from George Abu Kazan, who's the Latin Apostolic Vicar of Aleppo. He said that after 10 years of war, what the Syrian people are asking for is to put an end to the war and the sanctions that only affect poor people and which are a kind of crime against humanity. How much we would have liked to celebrate the end of this war, not the anniversary of this war, which has changed Syria and the region. So, James, do you think that that is a viable outcome, the end of sanctions, and would that be the way forward in your view?
I think it's quite difficult to imagine at the moment because there's been absolutely no response from the regime about changing its behavior, its brutal behavior towards the people. And I think the best hope lies actually with the Russians who have been pursuing their own political process, the Astana process, which unfortunately hasn't got very far. And I think it's plausible that some people in Moscow would welcome a new kind of political process, one which doesn't declare Astana to be a failure, but which actually builds in a new way. And I think Europe has a major part to play in that. But it would also take quite a lot of leadership from Washington as well.
So, Reem, do you think there is a chance of any meaningful dialogue potentially facilitated by this conference?
Sorry. Dialogue, you mean between who and who?
Any sides that need to speak together to come to a solution?
I don't think the conference itself is aimed at dialogue, really. It's more like a donor conference, pledges, setting the form of support. But maybe the outcome, the statements will hint at some potential dialogue or negotiations on issues like the sanctions that were just mentioned. And let me just say one thing on sanctions. I mean, there isn't one analysis fit all for sanctions. Not all of them were harmful to the people. Some were very targeted at individuals who took direct role in the war and committed war crimes. Others, affected the overall economy and heavily affected the lives of ordinary people. And the regime managed to redirect the impact of the sanctions away from itself towards the people. So I would think like for the EU, because now the biggest card they can play is the economic one, they need to devise a new strategy for Syria with a robust economic component, and in which sanctions could be used as a constructive tool, but that is only if it's aligned with other elements and not if all the burden of achieving change is laid on the sanctions. And I think transformation from conflict-related as to economy to more productive economy should also be key element in this strategy. So the easing or lifting of some of the sanctions, together with some current modes of funding and with further potential funding for economic recovery and early recovery, I think should be used as an incentive, like conditional, with clear steps. We do this if you do that, and so forth. So it can lay the ground really for some form of dialogues and negotiations in the future.
And Samah Hadid, what do you think? Is the time ripe now for dialogue to begin?
Well, it's long past time for dialogue to begin, really. And we often hear that countries are looking to the US to play a bigger leadership role on Syria. But I think we've only heard from the US that it's deprioritizing Syria. And I think it's time now for the EU and governments in the EU to step up and play that leadership role to really forge and lead a way forward that pushes on with longer term assistance that is aimed at investing and improving Syrian lives, that pushes for a political settlement where governments can influence warring parties to reach an agreement, and that ensures that rights is at the center of any policy and approach.
And James, do you think it's time for the US to reverse its idea of deprioritizing this conflict?
I think it's also tangled. The top priority for the administration is making improvements in the relationship with Iran. And that is a prerequisite before anything can be done in Syria, because Iran is really holding all the security cards, along with Russia, in Syria. And I think the Biden administration would like to engage Iran. Iran, of course, is playing hard to get, quite rightly. They've got elections coming up in May, presidential elections. We won't know probably for a year whether the US effort with Iran makes any progress. But I'm sorry to say, I think that until that begins to unlock a bit, and Israel is very important here too. Israel is strongly opposed to the presence of Iran in Syria. The Syrian regime has virtually become a client state of Iran. It's totally dependent on it, economically, in intelligence terms, in security terms. So we're not talking about the Bashar al-Assad regime being a rational actor which would see value in negotiations. It's shown how ruthless it can be for its own survival. It's shown how much it's a prisoner of Iran and to a large degree of Russia. And now we have the resurgence of ISIS terrorism insurgency in the east of Syria, which is very threatening, and it's threatening Iraq as well. So I'm afraid the clock is not going forward. It's winding back. We're going back to the ghastly situation we've had for several years. I'd love to say otherwise, and I'd love to say that, a fresh resolve by Europe to lead a dialogue would solve things. Of course, that's the right way to face, but it's simply not going to make any progress until quite a few other elements have fallen into place.
Dr. Reem Turkmani, James Watt isn't hopeful of progress, unfortunately. Are you hopeful? Do you think there is anything that can be done now to start things moving in the right direction?
I can't afford but to be hopeful, and when I talk to people on the ground, despite everything, they still remain a little bit hopeful. But I agree. I think the fact that the US is not making Syria as a priority is very, very disappointing. But I think we can also tackle the US approach through the counterterrorism lens, because the US now sees Syria mainly through the counterterrorism lens. And I think that's a good entry point to convince everyone that to really end terrorism threat coming from Syria, you have to push for a political solution. You have to end this conflict. You just cannot keep this wound, hemorrhaging on and on and on. The other hope is really the Syrian people, the ordinary people, and they are just amazing how they're coping with everything with extreme difficulty, but they just always manage to cultivate hope, and that keeps us going, keeps us trying to do everything we can do. We're sitting abroad to say that those people deserve a fair solution to their crisis that goes beyond just ending the humanitarian element of it.
So Samah Hadid, are you hopeful, and what would peace in Syria look like to you?
Well, of course, I remain hopeful because we hear from young Syrians every day that they have hope and they want to rebuild their country. And so we need to be supporting these voices. We need to be supporting these Syrians to reach that dream and that goal. Now is not the time to be abandoning Syrians or turning our backs towards Syrians 10 years on since the start of the conflict. If anything, we need renewed efforts to reach a lasting ceasefire, to find a political solution to the conflict, and to support Syrians to rebuild their lives. So I think now is definitely the time to double our efforts.
Let's hope some progress can start to be made. Samah Hadid, James Watt and Dr. Reem Turkmani, thank you very much, all of you, for joining us on Roundtable. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for TRT World Roundtable. But for now, from me and all the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.